Do you want to know what the fallen are, little one? In a sense, they are angels, but not the angels your mom imagines she prays to. Brass trumpets picnicking in the clouds. In their true essence, they are great swirling engines of wing and blood, fiery eyes that peer around the corners between worlds. Dark, radiant things conjured from fresh battlefields. A Frankenstein's Valkyrie, forever crashing to Midgard. What grief demands their hate, what vast cannibal hunger.
Welcome to the Fallen Cycle Mythos podcast. This is a universe full of secrets, waiting for those brave or foolhardy enough to seek them out. Cycle 1. Tales from When I Had a Face was written and produced by James Curcio, with editing by Brian Johnson. A modern fairy tale about death, loss, and finding redemption in the strangest places for those of us still haunted by the uncertain, occult logic of dreams. The fully illustrated black and white edition of this book is available at Amazon.com. The soundtrack features the work of David Bessel, along with additional contributions credited in the individual episode notes. Support for this project is pivotal. By becoming a patron at patreon.com/mythosmedia, that's MYTHOS media, you enable us to make more content like this and to be able to hire on more freelance artists in future works. Discover more about the transmedia Mythpunk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com. This podcast contains adult themes and may induce psychosis. And now, this week's episode. Season 2. Episode 3. Crumbling Statues, Forgotten Memories.
A wise Oyun does not entirely believe in even the very spirits they entreat. Nothing returns to nothing, but an endless absolute night isn't a night at all. There must be an eye in the darkness, or else there's naught to see. Just sinew and femur, just wood and polished rock. The spirit is a lie, and it begs to be set free. Our forced march continued. The sun rose and the dead reappeared, seeming to dance on the syrupy horizon until that blazing orb crested the mountains and blasted the waste with her wrath. But I knew the dead do not rise again. They lay still, forever, sheaths of skin and bone, leaching into the stones of the earth. Something loomed into view to the southeast. At first it seemed another of those spectral forms that rose, swelled, and vanished in the heat. But instead of disappearing, it darkened, now taking the shape of faces, like 4 old men who wearily chose to lay down one day and could never again rise. Amongst the upper reaches of weathered cliffs, they looked off toward the dimming horizon, with sockets that had long ago lost their sight. Was this statue a natural illusion sculpted by millennia of blowing sand, or was it shaped by human hands now mostly worn away? I turned to Eluane. Who carved these figures? They are relics of those who came before, he said. Even ghosts forget their past eventually, but I can still hear them when I pass through places such as this. Of the time before the sundering, no tales are told, not in the libraries of Ashanti, nor even the memories of Chatillians. Just hints, fragments. They dwelled here long before any recollection. They even once wandered in your world through thin spaces where the boundary is weakest, just as you came here. This is such a place, or what is left of it. It's an awful thing, I said, to be forgotten. He concluded a few moments later, as if completing my thought for me, though that is not what I meant. I too had been orphaned from my world, but I did not carry my past with me. I had left it in a shallow grave, and now sought something that could never be put down so easily. I had been strong, but everything strong breaks. Of this I remained silent, but I prodded him to tell me more. Alteran was once the font of all life. You must feel it, but it is only an echo of what it had been. All those who have come here have been lured by its balmy breeze, a paradise away from time and death. Little did they know that they would bring death and war and politics with them. We no longer recall any of the names of those who came before, or what they looked like, or how their voices sounded, if indeed they had voices. We honor them as the fourth of the fine peoples. In their place, we now have only the blighted, hungry star. She is burrowed into the heart of this place, and we must forever trim her buds before they sprout, as we wait for a spring that may never again come. I shivered suddenly, involuntarily, and although I felt the need to press him for more, it also seemed to me that anything that could prompt the change I saw in his aspect might be best left alone. In his eyes, I saw horrors, the horrors of boundless life, mutations beyond reckoning, a now mostly forgotten age of monsters. A raven landed on his shoulder and seemed to whisper in his ear. He looked up and out toward the open sky behind us and shielded his eyes. Wallaj stood beside him, stoic as a statue at a war memorial. Indeed, he walked through life now like one who is already slain, but hasn't yet felt the blowland. "The ravens are unsure if we are followed," Eluane said. "Let them come," Wallaj said with sharpened steel in his voice. We weaved northward. Even the Imari struggled to keep a straight heading. Many times we stopped, sweating and heaving in the sullen heat, hunting for our bearings through a broom of chalk and grief. Our vision had grown blank out there in that blasted bowl, as if we no longer saw one another looking eye to eye. The days were empty of all else but the taste of salt on our lips and an impenetrable silence that seemed to quiet even the wind itself. The nights were harsh and frigid, and they passed without apparent mark or measure. We had more than a few great hunters in our small band, but out here there was no game to replenish our supplies, not even field mice, and our hope seemed to diminish with each shrinking step. This monotony was shattered when I suddenly heard Samah shout, "You must have known!" I spun around and saw him howling at Wallaj in mad animal pain. Everyone was startled, even Samah himself seemed so, but not Wallaj. "Known?" he grunted. His eyes were bovine. He didn't even return Samah's fierce stare. "Known what?" "Don't deny it. You must have heard whispers." "I can't speak for all of my people, Samah," Wallaj said, but Samah seemed not to hear. "You're telling me you never saw it in their eyes as they plotted to butcher us? Never. The very people who carried you out of the mud. We should have recognized you for what you were." "Ishara." Samah's voice broke when he spoke his sister's name. "You did that to her," he finally said, spitting out each word like they burned his tongue. Before he knew what he was doing, Samah was raining down blows on his former Abdal. Wallaj stood in place, looking off into the gray distance, his blood sprinkling the thirsty ground. A crack across the jaw finally sent him reeling, and he collapsed heavily, still as a tree stump where he fell. "Enough!" Eluane yelled, rushing toward them. Samah looked back at Eluane, his bloodied hand still raised for another strike. "I don't care who you are. I'll watch him gag as his lungs fill with dirty blood." Eluane locked gazes with him, although his face remained impassive. No one seemed to breathe. Finally, Samah looked away and his hand shook. "Please," Wallaj sighed again and again. A thick bubble of red spittle formed over his mouth without bursting. His eyes opened, pleading with his attacker. But was he asking to live or to die? Samah's hand found the hilt of his sword, hesitated at the pommel, and then a moment later its blade was gleaming in the dull air. He would give him his wish. Wallaj grinned, waiting for the stroke to fall, greeting with what pride he retained that which had already been destined. But the blade's shimmering surface seemed to work some hypnotic spell, for Samah had caught his own reflection. The eyes were wild, the mouth drawn in an expression he did not recognize. He lurched backward, nearly collapsed, and with great effort slid the sword back into its sheath, as if it suddenly weighed 100 pounds. Then, their heads bowed, their foreheads touching, he and Wallaj were weeping together, sitting on their knees in the dust. I looked away, not able to bear the sight. Eluane bent down to take Samah's hand and pulled him to his feet. "This settles it. Eluane proclaimed to the gathered Imari a moment later. "We should part ways." Samah was incredulous. "You would abandon us so quickly?" Eluane took a step toward him, his patience clearly at an end. "I am not abandoning you, but I no longer think it is wise to bring so many through Chernaya. Now this is my counsel. Take yourselves to Orman. Theirs are the only walls south of the divide that can hope to withstand the coming storm for a time. I will keep the texts and bear them safely with us." Al-Wahalan looked up at him skeptically as he spoke, and then back the direction they had come. "Even if we wanted to do this, the ruins of our home lie between us and that distant city. Turn back and find the winding paths that run through the mountains. There you are likely to avoid your pursuers. When you get to Orman, remind their rulers of the treaties you hold, and their merchants of the wealth they couldn't have built without your help. They will protect you. They must protect you," Eluane said. Al-Wahalan sighed but shook his head and said nothing. "You are already heavily burdened. I couldn't ask this of you," Al-Wahalan said. "Ask it of me instead. I will carry the memory of the Imari," said Wallaj, motioning towards the numerous packs that now strained the refugees' shoulders. Samah considered and, despite his simmering anger, found a strange symmetry in the idea. He put his hand on his father's back. "This is your decision to make." Al-Wahalan's features softened. "Eluane sees further than any of us can on a good day, and this has not been a good day." He took his son's hand in his own. "We will listen. But our future, if we have a future, will be written about King Samah, when that too becomes history. I have no future now, save to teach you what I can from the days that are now past, when this was my kingdom. I will send emissaries to you if we succeed in our quest to rebuild the order. Or perhaps I will speak with you again after your death," Eluane said. The Imari refugees solemnly unloaded their collection of scrolls and books into the already heavy packs borne by Wallaj, who accepted the added weight as some silent penance, and then, with hardly a word, they marched off into the glowering twilight. We watched them go, their heads hung low, never to see them again in that world. "Come," Eluane said, turning away from them. He gazed up at the hint of stars that had appeared in the darkening sky, and the void in their midst. The comet had already crossed the outer ring and obscured the other stars that had once been painted on the domed ceiling of Ashanti's palace.
"What became of the Imari?" Ayta asked, her eyes wide with wonder, awe, and more than a little foreboding. Gran stopped and took a long look at her granddaughter, considering just how much she should tell. Ayta pouted, immediately discerning the hesitation. "Well," Gran said with a raspy chuckle, "what are you, 11? 12? I'd knifed a man by that age, so I guess you're old enough to know." Ayta raised an eyebrow. "You're kidding." He had it coming, you can believe that. "Well, what became of them?" I think of something Wallaj once told me about the history of his people, which was slightly different than the story I had heard from Samah. He said, "The ancestors of Mythpunk and Imari were twin brothers long ago. Two brothers lost in the waste who struck out in two directions, in the hope that at least one would survive. My ancestors went south, theirs west, so we say that fate and luck are twins." It was later rumored that Mythpunk warriors caught up with the remainder of the royal family somewhere on their way to Orman. They woke in their bedrolls to the feel of sharp steel scraping their beards. The prince was beheaded, that once beautiful crown chained to his father's chest. This was repayment for his vanity, they said. The king's arms were split off at the elbows with a single whack of a red-hot blade, cauterized on the spot, so as to keep him from removing that most beloved face as it gradually withered into a skull. Then, the king was set free. For years to come, people would claim they heard his chains rattling as he wandered the lonely places of the world, still babbling to his long-dead son and daughter. This is how their last king would be remembered. Whatever the truth of these accounts, perhaps they were lies, told to cover for the Mythpuk's inability to stamp out the Imari completely, and thus ensure their own liberation. Who can say? Would an old, armless cripple in rags shuffle through the streets of Orman, claiming he was once king of the desert? Or did Samah and his father instead reach that southernmost city by the sea and slowly rebuild a new Imari? Either may be true. Ayta scowled, not at all perturbed by the grisly account, but feeling somehow cheated by this turn at the lack of a clear and decisive ending. That uncertainty knocked around in her head long after Gran's tale was done. The sense that stories are not bound to us, but we to them, and they make no promises as to where they may carry us.
Our diminished party moved ever onward through the waste, pressing forward only with Eluane's guidance and the light that emanated from a crystal he held aloft in the otherwise interminable gloom. We held a length of rope between us so as to not lose one another entirely. Alabaster sand swirled around us playfully, as if there was some sentience to the wind that whimsically considered our plight a joke. Directly ahead, I could see Elena casting furtive glances upward, pleading with the sky to serve as her confessor. I finally could bear it no more, and asked her what was on her mind. She resisted, but I would not let her off so easily. Of course she wanted to tell me. I thought it was written all over her face. She needed me there to twist her arm, to lend an ear. Plus, I wanted to know what horror could reside in the bones of such a harmless little thing. Sure enough, she relented almost straight away. "It's the dreams again," she said, explaining how ever since that night in New Babylon, they had grown more vivid, more real. I saw what they had done to that woman as she was trained. The one I killed. I mean, when I saw inside her head, it was as if I experienced the torment of her transformation alongside her. Taken as children, they didn't want to do those things. None of them did. Following a script written so long ago that no one even recalls the author. The Lilitu may as well be figureheads for all the choice they have in the rituals that make them what they are. That makes them no less dangerous, Eluane said. "That's what scares me the most," she continued. Then she scowled and said, "What if there's something awful in me? What if I'm just plain awful?" "We all are in our own ways," I told her with a croaking laugh. What else could I say? She never shared with me what they had done or what she had seen. She frowned slightly and turned towards Eluane. "We walk and walk with no end. Are you leading us all to our deaths?" He stopped walking momentarily, but said nothing. Then he shuffled on ahead, even his tireless form heavy in the oppressive dryness of that place. Elena clearly had no more interest or energy to talk of dreams. I passed her the water skin and let the subject drop. She drank and handed it along to Nisa, who grabbed it greedily, her throat pulsing spasmodically as she gulped. "Hey, that's the last skin!" I cried, trying to snatch it away. She stepped out of reach and continued drinking, gripping the skin with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for shore. I saw then that her hands were cracking like ice in a glass of warm water, and at the same time her legs and arms were beginning to blister. "Eluane, Nisa is sick," I said as she fell to one knee, a piercing howl emanating from her wide gaping mouth. Eluane rushed to her side, keening into the night along with her, as if he was summoning a banshee to material form, but instead a raven fluttered from the sky to perch on his shoulder. "She isn't sick. She is hungry, very, very hungry." He knelt beside her. She had fallen conspicuously silent, and he felt for her pulse, then inspected her tongue. "I'm amazed she hasn't killed one of you already." I laughed, but Eluane gave me a stern glance. "I'm not joking, Ayta. Melier are formidable, especially when they lose control." Nisa's fingertips had grown into claws, sharp as the wicked barbs of a thorn bush, and she kneaded at the air with them. Wallaj stepped in front of Elena and I defensively, his eyes flashing, his dagger at the ready. She bared her teeth, now razors as well. "Until the demon leaves you, stay there, huh?" Wallaj said, his voice calm but his eyes wild. She kept her teeth bared but did not move to strike. Eluane was talking to Nisa now, quietly, like you might do to calm a frightened horse. He put a hand on her face, covering her eyes, and she immediately went rigid. He began to sing. His voice was sensitive, reedy, like a breeze blowing across the open tundra, skittering over low hills of snow and ice, and then punctuated by the hoot of an owl. He swept a feather out before him in a wide arc, his head bent sideways in an eerie way, almost as if he was again wearing a mask and it had started to slip. Then he stopped in place, gazing down upon Nissa with his distant, alien eyes. She stirred and croaked wordlessly. Eluane looked up at the moon. Elena grabbed for the water skin, but he stayed her hand. Neither moon nor water are enough now. Not even your fresh blood will do the trick. He then set to rummaging in the dusty packs, now discarded behind us. Producing a bound scroll, he unwrapped it, tearing off an arm's length. He regarded it preciously, as if he had cleaved it from his own father's body. Waller's eyes flashed, but he said nothing. He pinned the parchment to the ground with a spent bullet that had once tasted heart's blood. It was rust red and fell to the earth with all the solidity of a cannon shot. Then, for all his reverence, Eluane did not hesitate as he sparked that sacred text alight. When the charcoal began to flake, he scraped it away from the flame and scooped it into an outstretched palm. Then he smeared it on Nissa's chest, a circle of ash, which he split into 4 with a spit-wetted fingertip. Upon her belly he placed that blood-black stone, hot and stained from the flame, and then slid its leaden weight with his ring finger to the bottom right quadrant, where her belly pulsed rapidly like a serpent's tongue tasting the air. But the stone did not fall off, precarious as its purchase on her skin may have been. He blew on it, and then waited for a sound that only he could hear, a far-off dead plunk of stone enveloped by water. Then it was gone. And whatever had been parching her lips and stealing her breath relented like a spirit banished back into the abyss from whence it came. All this was brought to pass with a single breath, carrying the soul that had been locked in ink on that parchment, the solitary record of a life now lost. Eluane spoke then, as if he could read my thoughts. She will improve, but the life that graced those pages will never again appear in any world, above or below.
Now you should know, my Ayta, that the lesson I would learn from Eluane was not the one he likely intended, Gran said. All business is dirty, even Oyon business, a bit dirty. With his single breath upon her chest, also began a chain of questions that would lead indirectly, but nevertheless quite inevitably, to your birth. Here is how it started. I said to myself, if the fine can sustain themselves in Alteran as spirit in fleshy form, then might I do the same, flesh taking the place of spirit in the land they had forsaken to come here. One would need make oneself a place of worship, but also a home for terror and raving madness. Gran cackled and slapped her knee as if she had just told a good joke. And so have we Aytas become, but there is much more to tell you yet.
Nissa closed her eyes and rolled onto her side, and she did not move. Is she, I started. Eluane finished my thought. She's sleeping now, though she will not rise for many hours. I am also spent, he said, letting out a sigh as he sat. Then he peered up at Wallaj, standing sternly on the periphery, his arms crossed, as if guarding against the night itself. Wallaj, come. Eat. No, Wallaj said. You rest. There are still some here who need your guardianship. They need you to remain strong, Eluane said. He joined us in silence, and we made do with what we had left. I looked over at Eluane and finally voiced my concerns. We had been marching in these barren lands for days, and so far, no sign of Nirathea. He nodded. We are nearly there. It may have been many cycles, but I still remember the way in and through. There are mining shafts made for Chernaean plunder, which lead to the top of the Great Divide. This will allow us to slip into their city of Highmount, unrecognized, or at least that is my hope. There you may be of service, Elena. How? She asked. In Chernaya, your name may finally be of some use to us. She rolled her eyes, but the corners of her mouth turned up in a smile. As we drew closer to the divide, I'd noticed the bitter winds had ceased, replaced with the stillness of a forgotten tomb. Even without the wind, the night was cold. I shivered. The ritual fire was already mere embers, and we had nothing left to fuel more. I wonder, I mumbled to myself, and then trailed off when I realized I was speaking my thoughts aloud. "Yes?" he asked. "Never mind," I said. My head fell to his shoulder. He gazed at me and then turned back to that last, dwindling light as my eyes drifted closed, and I felt my belly wondering if the fine can give child to the living.
That's all for this week's episode. Stay up to date with upcoming episodes by subscribing at fallencycle.podbean.com or wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts. Check out the work of the contributing musicians. Those links and additional information is available in the text provided along with this episode. This audio edition was produced by James Kershaw, along with text-to-speech synthesis. A statement on the use of LLMs is available on our website for those curious about how we do and don't use these technologies. This podcast is Creative Commons 3.0, attribution, share and share alike, non-commercial use.